Sure, you'll be asked about it. All right.
I can do it myself too.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for joining the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, who's happy to be hosting EJ Dionne and Miles Rapoport. So we've had a program on American democracy and comparative perspective at CDDRL since 2013, I guess almost 10 years. And in that time, we've seen a renewed interest in political reform, and in particular in adopting reforms that other countries might have had as policies for a long time, especially in places where democracy seems slightly more functional than what we have today. So we are really glad to be discussing 100% Democracy, the new book from our two distinguished authors here that really takes the idea of universal voting and discusses how it would have a serious uptake in the United States. So just a few housekeeping issues. We will be first discussing the book for about 30 or 40 minutes before opening it to audience Q&A for those in the room. And on Zoom, if you have questions, please go ahead and direct them to the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll be happy to get to those in the Q&A as well. Further, we wanted to thank the Packard Foundation for their co-hosting of this event, and there will be a reception right through those doors after the event with a lot of food. So please join us. And finally, I just wanted to thank our team here at CDDRL, including Amy Whalen, who so excellently puts together these hybrid events for all of us to enjoy. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers in case you aren't already familiar. EJ Dionne is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, a professor at Georgetown, and a visiting professor at Harvard University. He is the author of Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. Miles Rapoport is a senior practice fellow in American democracy at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance at the Harvard Kennedy School. He formerly served in the Connecticut State Legislature and as Connecticut's Secretary of State. He also served as president of Demos and of Common Cause. So I'll start by just asking them some questions about the ideas in this book. First, this is a book about universal voting, which is a policy that's been suggested a few times in American history, but has never really gained traction. What led you both to look more at universal voting as a solution to some of America's political problems? And what do you think universal voting might be able to achieve?
Well, I guess you want me to start? Yeah,
Okay,
I will start. First, I want to say a slew of thank yous. One is to this center and the work it does, to Larry Diamond, who we are all grateful to, and to Dee Dee, who, if you haven't read it, I think my favorite article ever in the Washington Post was her review of our book.
Compared to his hundreds of articles.
I told Dee Dee it wasn't just that she was quite kind to our book, but it's rare. It's rare for a reviewer to read the book as you hope you wrote it. And she heard us in a way that I was just so grateful for and was very kind. And again, Larry and the center, Stanford has really been at the forefront of democracy issues for so long. I also want to thank the executive director, that's your title, right, Diane, of the New Press. This book wouldn't exist without her. Miles and I worked for a couple of years, and Miles can tell the story more because he was the leading organizer of it with a working group on this topic. And when Diane heard about it, she had always wanted a book on this topic and called us. And we said, you bet, we would love to do this book. And so this book draws on the work we did together with an extraordinary group of scholars, lawyers, activists, civil rights and voting rights folks. I mean, a really fine group of people who, where we sort of tested the idea against criticism, against problems. And I just have to say, I think there's another old friend of mine in here whom I will not identify because your mask is fooling me. So oh my gosh, because I have two very dear friends from high school here who came out. Hi, I'm right. Is my memory right? No.
John Tinker.
Oh my God, it's you, John. See, I thought you were in high school, so I made you younger. I didn't recognize you. An old Brookings colleague, and one of my dearest friends from high school, Steve Baca, is sitting here. And I got to say, high school is a complicated time.
Indeed.
And Steve was not only an incredibly smart person, but he was one of the sweetest hearted, most generous people in high school. That's a really rare thing. And he was beloved in our household. So I can't tell you we haven't seen each other in 50 some years, I believe, or close to, except once in 50 years, I think. So, oh, John, that's so good. I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you. John is the author of one of the singularly most important political science concepts. It's sort of the path dependency. Thank you. Which is you start here, and that really matters to where you end up, is the very simplified answer to a brilliant theory that he unrolled. So this book and how we came to it. It seems to me there are two things Miles and I have talked about a lot. One is we think American elections should no longer be like fancy dinner parties. Because if you think of our elections and how they're organized, there is an A list of likely voters. And those are the people the politicians and political consultants spend an enormous amount of time on. They send them letters, they send the political ads are aimed at them, emails, all kinds of online conversation. If you're not on that A list, if you're on the B list or C list, you get little or no attention at all from political campaigns, which in a way takes our low turnout and reinforces it, because it says these people will vote, these people won't vote, so forget about them. And by forgetting about them, you are sending them a message that they don't count. And you are also not doing anything to say, hey, it's worth looking at this democratic process. I've taken to quoting the great Michael Connelly's great detective, Harry Bosch. Any Harry Bosch fans in the audience? His slogan was, as a detective, everybody counts or nobody counts. And in a way, this idea comes from that. One other thing about the politics of the A list and the B list and the C list is how it encourages campaigns to be run. Ask the question, why are we polarized? There are a million different answers that are valid to that question. But surely one of them is that by having only likely voters expected to turn out, 50% at a great midterm turnout election in 1980, 2/3 of us in a great turnout election in 2020, by expecting only your people to come out, the emphasis is on doing anything possible to turn out your base. Miles taught me the term enrage to engage. And you've got a lot of that going on in campaigns, but also there's a big effort made to turn off the other side. A lot of negative advertising aims not just at persuading people to vote against the other person, but actually to keep his core vote or her core vote to stay at home. There was a lot of that went on in 2020. So that's one reason we came to this. The other reason we came to this is because of our struggles over voting rights. And Miles and I both, and Miles can talk about his path, came to this because we really want to stop once and for all moves toward voter suppression in the United States. And we both believe that declaring a civic and legal duty to vote is the best way to defend it as a right, because in order to have voting as a legal duty, you have to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. So we have to not tear down the progress we made in the 2020 election of making it easier to vote, but actually build on that. Have a registration system that automatically includes everyone. A research assistant who helped me when we were working on this book was looking over Australia's laws, and our system is largely modeled after Australia's. And she came rushing into my office and said, look at all these cool things Australia does to help people vote, to help people register. And there's no reason why we can't do that in the United States. And so that's why we came here, and we'd love to sort of draw you into this idea, maybe even the fight for it. I'll just close by saying that we know this idea is not going to be adopted tomorrow morning, but we need to sort of take a fundamental look at our system at a time when democracy is under stress. If this seems radical, consider that the secret ballot, another idea we adopted from Australia, back at the turn of the 19th and into the 20th century, the secret ballot was seen as a radical idea that those Aussies had tried out. If you want to read a great New Yorker piece, we have a footnote to Jill Lepore's great piece in the New Yorker, the great historian, on how we adopted the secret ballot. We wouldn't think of not voting by the secret ballot now. We hope similarly over time, by pushing this idea in states and localities, to get people to say about this, not why, but why not? Miles, the former, oh, by the way, one thing I learned from this, which no one else in the world knows, is the Secretary of State in Connecticut is the only state in the country where the formal title, and there's no reason you should know this because I certainly didn't, is Secretary of the State.
Oh,
So secretaries of state in Connecticut are higher than any other secretary of state in America. I learned that only because Miles sent me something and said, would you correct this? And it was, anyway.
And they're very,
they're some of the most-
the secretary of the former secretary of the state of Connecticut. Go ahead.
well, I want to add, thank you, EJ. I want to add two acknowledgements. First, I do want to acknowledge EJ because I'll come back to this.
Wait, can I interrupt? I failed to say.
I can't get a word in edgewise.
No, that's true. When I did my list, I was so taken by seeing Steve Bacher that I forgot to thank Miles. And what I always tell everybody about Miles, it was a real joy to work with him. Miles has so much energy that if Europe tapped him, they would never need another drop of Russian oil or gas. So he's a real natural resource.
Anyway, so it's been a pleasure to work with EJ. He compliments me all the time. It's very nice. But I also want to acknowledge and appreciate Nancy Lindborg, the president of the Packard Foundation, who, as Dee Dee already said, is sponsoring the reception afterwards, where we have to eat a lot. And also her husband, Steve Cull, who's a major figure in the deliberative democracy movement. We met many years ago. So thank you both for being there, for being here. So how I get into it in a slightly different way, and EJ is part of the story. So I have been a kind of voting rights advocate and a kind of democracy reform person for probably 40 years, starting out even before I was in the state legislature in Connecticut and Secretary of the State, but there and at Demos and at Common Cause. I've done all kinds of work on a variety of voting rights and democracy reforms, and I believe in them strongly. So same-day voter registration, early voting, expanded mail-in voting, restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. There's a whole suite of democracy reforms that I have worked on and believed in strongly. And so fast forward to 2018 and 2020, the 2018 midterm elections were the record turnout for a midterm election in the United States at 50%. And the 2020 elections were a record turnout in presidential elections at 66.2% or 66.6, depending on how you want to do it. So I'm delighted that we achieved records in 2020, especially given the COVID and all the adjustments and struggles that took place around voting in that election. But at 50 and 60%, that's nothing really to write home about. So I started to say, okay, after 35 years of doing this, you know, and moving the needle and working really hard at it, and we've moved the needle. There are a lot of people who want to move that needle sharply backwards. We know that, and they have to be fought. But is there something that could really move the needle? And then I read an article that EJ had written along with his Brookings colleague, Bill Galston, making from 2015, making the case that the United States should really seriously consider this idea. And I was dumbstruck, really. So the first thing I thought is, here I've been working on this for 40 years, 35 years, 40 years ago, meld together. And I have never been in a conversation about universal voting, even though it has been successfully used in Australia for 100 years, since 1924. So I decided this is something that I really need to learn about. And when I bumped into EJ at Harvard, I said, why don't we create this working group? Why don't we really work on this issue and take a serious look at it? And to my great delight, he said yes. So we had a working group. We looked at this for 2 years. We did all kinds of reading about Australia. We had opponents of it come in. We did a poll through the Democracy Fund. We did a lot of really interesting work. We had a terrific group of people. And we put out a report in 2020, which was called Lift Every Voice, the Urgency of Universal Civic Duty Voting. In the middle of the pandemic, it got some attention, got written up in the Times, and C-SPAN covered it, and like that. And then, lo and behold, we got a call from Diane Wachtel, as EJ said, the publisher of the New Press, saying, I have wanted somebody to do this book for years. Would you be willing to do it? And we said yes. So that's how the book came about. I am completely sold on the idea. I don't think, by the way, that it is like the solution to all of what ails American democracy. It doesn't solve the campaign finance problem. It doesn't solve the electoral college problem. It doesn't solve the Senate representation problem. But on the other hand, on the fundamental issue of do Americans participate, this, I think, gives us the chance to have if not 100% participation, then 90% participation. And that would be a much, much better democracy for reasons we'll come back and talk about further.
Exactly. So I do want to get into the nitty gritty of the proposal itself, like how would universal civic duty voting work? But before we get there, this is an interesting and very good time for political reform in the United States, both because of a bad reason, which is that we're in a sort of political crisis that has been both long running and also sort of very immediate, but also because of what you mentioned, which is a lot of state activity over voting rights. So we're seeing a new fight at the state level. The Brennan Center says that 25 states have eased access to voting by sort of legislating the COVID-19 sort of changes and adaptations that they made. But 19 other states have restricted access to the ballot by rolling back that kind of access. We know that President Biden made political reform part of his agenda. He wanted to pass the For the People Act, which passed the House in 2018 and again in 2020. Even when it was sort of reformed into the Freedom to Vote Act, it still failed to pass. Maybe that's a filibuster question, but what do you think universal voting, what kind of moment is it for this kind of proposal? And how would it interact with this other suite of voting reforms that you just mentioned?
Do you want to start there?
No,
Since
go
I
ahead.
went, a couple of things we try to make clear in the book. One is we are not 19th century elixir salesmen peddling this will cure all that ails you. And we are very clear about that in the book. And we have at the end of the book, we talk about other problems that the democracy has to solve. On the other hand, we believe, and we argue that this would cure a number of problems that might make some of those easier to solve. I should also say, by the way, one of the ways I got into this personally is I've spent, for various reasons, a lot of time in Australia over the last 20 years. So I actually got to watch this system work up close. And Australians are very proud of this system. And it's a system that turns elections from a dreary 6-hour wait in a line into literally a party. There was, we quote someone in Australia, an Australian voter who told the New York Times a few years ago, in Australia, voting is like a party. All elections are held on a Saturday, which opens up all the public schools. At polling places in Australia, every school and civic group sells something good to eat. I mean, the biggest problem with civic duty voting is everybody would gain 5 pounds and it would create healthcare problems. But, and they're particularly famous for their democracy sausages. And it is such a where people sell to people who've come to vote. They don't deny people water, they sell them sausages. And this is such a thing in Australia that a friend of mine in Australia recently saw the book, sent me a ruling by the Australian Election Board saying the onion belongs on the top of the democracy sausage, not the bottom. So the Election Board has a sense of humor in Australia. And we, by the way, in the book insist that if we do this, we should also have vegan alternatives. This is America. So what this idea does is we hope on the one hand, we think all these other reforms are necessary. And we call them in our book gateway reforms to our ideas. You referenced the polling we did, which we can come back to. But one of we were looking for the legitimate objections to this idea that people might have. And one of them is certainly that if you impose this requirement on the system as we now have it, where at least half the country is making it harder for people to vote or obstructing some groups from voting, you can't have universal civic duty voting. You just can't do it that way. So we are for all of these sorts of reforms. But when you declare that everyone votes, and you also insist, as we do in the book, on spending serious public money, not huge, but it doesn't take a lot to run an election, but the election administration is something that is chronically underfunded because it's something people take for granted when they fight over the city budget. That I don't blame them. A politician will get more trouble for cutting the schools than cutting a little bit of money out of election administration. If you administer the roles right, if the government tends them properly, where you really do everything you can to eliminate all but the false charges of, a lot of the fears of rigging elections are false and demagogic. But if you do a bang-up job to make it easy for everybody to register, tend to the rules, and then say, everybody must vote. Therefore, no one feels excluded. Therefore, no group that says, they're trying to push that group to the polls and keep us away. If you get rid of that entire conversation, we think you can make progress. As we'll probably get back to, we know this won't be adopted nationally tomorrow morning. We think a lot of states and also cities could adopt it. If I could say one last thing on this question, one of my favorite lines in your review, I told you before we came in, is you called us naive in a good way. First she says we're naive, and then I said, I wonder where she's going with that. And then she said, we need some hopefulness in our conversation right now. So I treasured that. But we just want to say we are hopeful and yes, aspirational, but we're not impractical. And we quote Nick Stephanopoulos, a professor at Harvard Law School, who suggests, if you want this to happen, what would happen in a state where this was possible, where, say, 2 big cities made this compulsory, and suddenly we're producing these vast turnouts? Wouldn't rural areas that didn't have civic duty voting want to say, we want to join with that too? Now, again, we're realistic enough to know maybe the legislature would just bar those 2 cities from doing that. That's the other end. But I think we could create some interesting practical fights in the country that might push this idea forward.
Great. Miles?
Yeah, I think the idea is what we're trying to do here, and again, I also like the naive in a good way line in your review, is to put forward a kind of a north, in my mind at least, a North Star of what is it that we really want. It's not that we want to penalize people, but we want to create a culture of full participation. And we think that's possible. I think right now we're in a kind of vicious cycle where government is not performing the way it should. People don't feel engaged. Voter suppression is discouraging people. There are all kinds of ways in which participation is not encouraged. But we think if you made the fundamental kind of philosophical statement that everyone counts, everyone should participate, we're willing to say everyone is required to participate, then you can start an upward cycle. Because I think if that's the case, then a lot of different things would happen. First of all, I think that, immediately you have a gigantic leap in turnout. In Australia, it went from 60% just before this happened to 90%. And it has stayed there. 2019, 96.3% of people in Australia are registered and 91.9% of them went to the polls. But secondly, the actual voting electorate will become far more fully reflective of the population as a whole. We do this for jury duty, and for the very same reason. The reason we make jury duty compulsory is that you want the decision making about whether someone's guilty or innocent and what the appropriate punishment is to be made by a jury of their peers, all of our peers. Same thing applies to voting as far as I'm concerned. So I think, so the electorate will become much more reflective. Then I think all the institutions in society would bend themselves to making this work and making it possible. EJ already mentioned that election officials would have a real responsibility if people were required to vote, to make it possible for them. And I think it would be a real antidote to the voter suppression. Secondly, I think the various other institutions, if I were a principal at a high school and I knew that every single graduate was required to vote, would I make civic education a more important part of the curriculum? I would say that I would. Similarly, if I'm an employer and I know that all of my employees have to vote, are required to vote, would it make me more likely to give them the time and the ability to do so? I think yes. And I think that would go sort of across the board. So I think, and lastly, I'll just say that I do think that it really would change the way the incentive structure for political parties. Right now, and I've been a candidate 11 times, the goal is only to talk to likely voters, because otherwise you're wasting your time. In the situation where you have to talk to everybody, because everybody is going to vote, and therefore everybody is always listening, the game becomes not so much a turnout game or a depress your opponent's game, but it becomes a persuasion of all of the people, not just the ideologues and the regular always voters. And I think that would be incredibly healthy for the way campaigns are run.
Could I jump off one
Please.
important point I think Miles made, which is, one of the common questions here is who is likely to be added to the electorate if you did something like this. And as best we can tell from from the research, you would definitely make the electorate significantly younger, because one of the groups that undervotes are young people. And our system makes it really hard on young people, because older people tend to be more stationary. They have the same address. Their voter registration stays solid election to election. Young people, by necessity and by the nature of their life, move around a lot. And our election laws don't always accommodate that easily. It's why one of the most important reforms has been election day registration, which definitely boosts youth turnout. But we think the electorate would be younger, and I think that would make us more forward-looking as a country. It would bring in more lower income voters. It would almost certainly bring in a more non-ideological voters. And that's commonsensical, because the people who turn out to vote, people who feel really strongly from the right to the left, are much more likely to vote than people with less firm ideological views, which might actually have a moderating effect on the political debate. That seems to be its impact in Australia. And then lastly, it would create real barriers to voter suppression against Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, and others, because it is saying outright, everybody has to vote. Ralph Nader likes to say it would become against the law if people tried to stop somebody from voting. And whether you read it that way or not, you don't have to read it that way. But I think the notion that it would just stop that sort of activity, because we accept that everybody should vote, is also an important piece of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So when I took on the sort of task of reviewing the book, I was also a skeptic. It's already hard enough to convince Americans that some political reform is probably going to be beneficial, but to ask them to, be mandated to vote when they, some of them won't even get vaccinated against COVID, it seems like a big lift. That said, I do think that after reading the first few chapters of the book, you realize this is not the type of voting you would want in a healthy democracy. There are a lot of biases, like you mentioned, and who is constituted in the electorate and how politicians make appeals to them. So the final question before we open it to the audience is, how would this work really? Like, what would the law say? You do have a sample law that has been proposed at the back of the book in the appendix. What would the law say? What would the punishment be for not voting? And what are some of the challenges you think to implementation? And what pathway would make it realistic to be developed? You already talked about state and local localities.
Yeah. So, our proposal is a recommendation to either to Congress potentially, but to state legislatures and municipal town or city councils. So the actual nitty-gritty of implementation would be in the legislation itself. But our recommendation, if legislators were listening, and we hope they are, is that a very small fine be imposed first. Major education about how to vote, when to vote, what the responsibilities are would take place, from election officialdom as well as political parties, so that you're really encouraging people. And those gateway reforms to make it easier for people to vote are also important. But then basically, if you didn't vote, you would get a letter. This is what happens in Australia, from the election administration, which in Australia and most other places are nonpartisan and civil service and professional. We're the only place that has partisan and elected election officials, and I say it's not a really good system.
I learned on
Having
this
been
book tour that Miles presided over a recount in one of his own elections.
Oh, really?
Amazing. Yeah, and he won the recount.
Fair and square. So anyway, and if you provide almost any reason, that's accepted in Australia. Very few people actually end up paying the fine, which is $20. Which is our recommendation. We also recommend that the fine not be interest accumulating, that there not be penalties, that it not be the basis of a civil warrant of any way, criminal warrant in any way. So this is obviously the question of what happens in places like, Ferguson, Missouri is the kind of what you call a poster child for this, where fees become metastasized up and then people find themselves in real trouble. We don't want that to happen. It's not obviously the intent. It is also our recommendation also that you don't have to fill out the ballot. You can pass in a blank ballot. And further, we recommend that there be a none of the above on the ballot itself. So it's very clear that you're not being pushed to vote for or against any particular thing. What the requirement is to participate, not to vote per se. So and then what would happen is that there would be a kind of enforcement mechanism of that kind. Legislatively, I think you would need to appoint a clear election authority. It might be the Secretary of State, it might be the Board of Elections, whose responsibility is to make sure that all this works seamlessly. So we're hoping in Connecticut, a former student of EJ's, a young state senator named Will Haskell, put the bill in to make voting obligatory in the state of Connecticut. And we'll see. And it's also been introduced in Massachusetts. So there is a tiny bit of pickup. But our basic idea is we need to put the idea into the public domain where it has never been, when it's never been. So of course, people's initial reaction is, what, are you kidding me? But I think that we can make a case that this is not so radical a concept. And for me, the last point I'll make is that the analogy to jury service is really important, because this is something that is a requirement of citizenship. It is a compulsion, so to speak. It was, as EJ has said, and Cornell William Brooks has said, as he was a member of our working group, this was a major victory of the civil rights movement in the South, was that Black Americans could serve on juries. But specifically, the victory was that Black people could be compelled to serve on juries equally with white people. And we think that the analogy here is that to the degree that we are compelled, then we are all genuine and empowered participants in the process.
Yeah, let me just underscore a couple of the details here that we thought a lot about it. For example, the desire not to have a Ferguson problem. As part of the working group, we talked to a very broad group of civil rights leaders who, by the way, were very sympathetic to this idea. The NAACP has endorsed this idea. But we wanted to make sure that there was nothing criminalizable here, that this wouldn't be compounded. And so we think it's very important not to have this fine be like other fines. Secondly, when you send in in Australia, it's a very simple system. You get your little notice that you didn't vote. If you give any reasonable excuse, like I was sick on election day or whatever, they don't fine you. They've just sent you the notice to remind you of the requirements, so that the last we checked, only 13% of non-voters actually had to pay the fine, which is less than 1%, I think, or 1% of the whole.
If 92% of the people are voting and only 13% of the non-voters, you're less than 1%.
Yeah. So in other words, it is a term that Miles likes to use, light touch enforcement. It's telling you that this matters. It's not trying to penalize you, but people are very aware of it. I was doing a TV thing a couple of weeks ago, and one of the camera women was Australian, and she said, "Oh, I got to pay my fine. I forgot to vote in the state election." And she was a very good cheer about it. She accepted that she failed to vote in the state election. It had just gotten this notice, so it's accepted. So that's a second point. The third point is that none of the above option is very important. We have a great legal chapter in the book, and I can praise our legal chapter because it was largely written by our lawyers. So I'm praising them, and we acknowledge a bunch of people who helped us with the book, where obviously, if anything is important in America, you'll have litigation, you're going to be sued. And so we really tried to test this idea, and Lord knows I am not going to predict ever how this current Supreme Court will deal with anything. But what is quite clear from the past litigation is that compulsory speech is a problem, that the government can't compel speech in most cases, but compelling behavior like service on jury duty is. That's why we go out of our way to make clear you can cast a blank ballot, and why we add the none of the above option. This isn't, and by the way, states, we've got a couple of states, Nevada and Arizona, who already have none of the above options on the ballot. They draw about 1 to 4%. And somebody at one of our talks asked us, what would happen if 30% check none of the above? And my first reaction was, if 30% check none of the above, that's something a democracy ought to know about. If people look at their candidates and check that box. My own personal view, it's not in the book, is that if none of the above ever won an election, you should just force a new election. And you can be sure that a lot of candidates would be ready to run, knowing how weak the existing candidates are. But for us, none of the above is simply a way of saying this isn't compelled speech. And then in the great American tradition, we also propose a conscientious objector status. There are some groups for religious or other reasons who may not want to participate in public life at all, and where you could file and get a conscientious objector status. All this is designed, one of the big reasons people have for opposing this is a straight out libertarian, you can't make me vote reason. And as you suggested, if we can't get a vaccine requirement to keep us alive, how do you expect people to support a voting requirement? And so we really go out of our way to say, we are not looking for a big intrusive government here. We're just looking for a kind of nudge. We think this system creates a strong nudge, and there are about 25 countries that have had this, democratic countries. We don't count North Korea. I think they have compulsory voting too, but that's not what we have in mind. But 25 democratic countries have this, and the level of enforcement that they have in Australia seems the right level to create very high turnout. And that's what we're looking for. Enforcement just tough enough to nudge most people to vote.
Okay, great. One final question before we open it up. What potentialities do you think this would create in our politics? So you have all of these people who don't turn out. If they did turn out, even if they just interacted in some way by, giving, by returning a ballot that was blank, you have some theories about how that might encourage a democratic renewal or more participation. Could you go into a little more detail?
Well, I think the first thing that would happen is that people would be part of the process in a way that many people are not part of the process now. And
right.
I'll tell you an anecdote from when I was a political candidate. So I loved going door knocking. It was the kind of favorite. I hated raising money, which is the other.
Right.
And someday we'll have another conversation about the question of money and politics in our society. But I love to go out and knock on doors. But what I was told by my campaign people was, here's a list. There's the registered voters, and the highlighted ones are what we called prime voters. Those are the people you want to talk to. Don't waste your time talking to anybody else. So I literally would walk down the street and would see, people sitting on their porch that would, maybe even look like they wanted to talk to me, but I was required to walk by. So I think the first thing that happens is that people get on the rolls, they get part of the process, they get mail, they get phone calls, they get candidates to stop and talk to them. They get, they matter, as opposed to now where so many people are completely outside of the whole conversation. So I think that's one very, very important thing. And I want to echo something that EJ said, which is I do think that would help lessen the polarization, because the enraged to engage spirit is so strong right now. It's so toxic. And, all you want to do is, gin up your base and get one more person from your base to do it. And if you're talking to everybody, I think it's not going to create civility overnight, but I do think that it would make the parties and candidates talk to everybody. And I think that would help moderate just a little bit.
Right.
What I want to do in answer to your question is just read something from Kim Beazley. Kim was the former leader of the Labour Party. He was Deputy Prime Minister, Australian Ambassador to the US, also an old friend of mine. And I interviewed him about their system. And Kim had some his dad was in politics. So he's been giving out Labour Party cards at polling places since he was a kid, basically. And so he's met a lot of voters as they're about to cast ballots, including people forced there and first of all, we are very hard in the book on this uninformed voter idea, which we think is anti-democratic to its core. And if you find people who hate our idea, they actually don't like the current electorate very much either. And we stand with V.O. Key, his book, The Responsible Electorate, which begins with a wonderful sentence that goes something like, the core and controversial argument of this little book is that voters are not fools. And that's what we believe. And that's what Kim believes. And so just let me read very briefly from what Kim told me. Beazley, whose father was a cabinet minister and who was himself first elected to the Australian Parliament in 1980, notes archly in response to criticisms about potentially uninformed voters that being, quotes, in quotation marks, informed about political affairs doesn't actually mean that you are. In fact, A lot of people who consider themselves informed and committed are card-carrying idiots. Yes, Kim is very outspoken. Beasley also speaks eloquently of how thoughtfully less politically engaged voters brought to the polls under the Australian system now take their obligations. And then this is Kim. I have stood at polling booths for the best part of 55, 60 years now, and from being quite a small boy. And I've never thought for 1 minute that the people who file past me and take the cards I hand to them are disinterested and absurdly ill-informed. They are engaged. Mentally, they are engaged. Now, they may have been forced to become engaged, and they don't pay attention at any other time of year. They move on with their private lives and are perfectly happy within them. But it's not too much to ask to have you pay attention for a period of, well, a month. One of the good things about compulsory attendance at the polls is that in our experience, people start to pay attention. So they may not bring to it the sort of systematic thinking of somebody who is politically expressed, but they do bring to it a sense of their interests and a sense of the interests of the country. And he also argues for the moderation of this electorate. He says in a situation where there's compulsory attendance at the polls, the card-carrying QAnon lunacy would go out the window. It's very hard to move people with normal politics, try to move them with lunatic politics, so that, Kim is quite confident that what you bring out, you bring the civic mindedness out in people when they know they have this obligation and they end up taking it seriously. Favorite picture of Australian election for me, 4 surfers in their wetsuits in a booth holding their surfboards near Bondi Beach. And it's clear they jumped out of the surf because they know they have to vote. They're casting their ballots and they're about to jump back in the surf. If surfer dudes and surfer women take compulsory voting seriously, that warms my heart.
That's great. All right, so we can open it up. We'd be happy to any audience questions. We have a mic in the middle, although if you project, we can likely hear you. And then if there are Zoom questions, we'll be taking those as well. So John and then Larry.
Does he need to use the mic?
Actually, for Zoom purposes, Amy, do you want us to? Okay, John, do you mind?
I'm sorry to bother you, John. It is so good to see you. I had lunch with this man at a lunch at Brookings almost every week. So I really.
Oh, that's lovely.
Hello.
Hello.
When I was in grad school, now this is 60 years ago, I did a term paper on Australian politics and learned about this, and it struck me as, gee, that's a pretty sensible thing to do. So, but
a prophet you are, John.
There you go. So I think the first thing I want to do is congratulate you on using the term universal voting rather than compulsory voting, because compulsory is a bad word in American politics, and so that's good. And there are 2 things that I wanted to say that give everybody some hope about this. One is that there are electoral reforms that do take place around this country. I mean, I'm thinking of the current move toward ranked choice voting.
Yes.
And it is moving. I mean, it's adopted in some places. They're going to use it in the Alaska runoff, for example. Alaska, for Pete's sake. So number one, it is possible to make changes. That's number one. And then the second cause for hope is your point about starting this in localities, particular localities, because that's the way change takes place in the U.S. It's a federal system, and you can start it in one place, and if it works there, then other places will pick it up, and so on. So, start it in Connecticut, or start it in some, Portland, Oregon, or some place like that, and if it works, it'll spread.
I think I once heard the term laboratories of democracy.
Could I just say thank you, John? I had no idea where you were going to end up on this. I had no idea where your path would lead you on this. So I appreciate that. And I also appreciate your point, which we make in the book, about reform is possible. And rethinking the past is possible. Rethinking long-standing practices is possible in our country. We were talking, Diane drove up with us. Heck, they're even rethinking daylight savings time. That there are many practices we have, including having elections on the first Tuesday after the first
Mhm.
Monday that go back to an agrarian society. It was market day back in 1840. I think it was 1844 when that was established, somewhere around there. There's no reason why we should be, have that as the permanent fact of American life. But even if we do keep it on the first Tuesday or after the first Monday, there's no reason why you can't have all the early voting and the like that we have now. And there's no reason why you can't make it a national holiday to make voting easier for everyone. And I think that the Saturday election, and I'm not recommending Saturdays, different people have different views about different days of the week, but by creating the holiday atmosphere and the fact that fewer people work on Saturdays actually makes the whole process easier. John?
Going away from Tuesday, you could declare a particular weekend with voting day. I mean, you could do it Saturday and Sunday.
Italians, I love this system. Italians had Sunday and Monday morning in case people went to the beach on the weekend, and they know how to live. I do think that kind of combination works too. There are a million ways we could do it. The UAW always made Election Day a holiday in their contracts, or they got Election Day as a holiday in their contracts because they wanted all their workers out working at the polls for the UAW's candidates.
Larry, did you have a question?
You want me to use this?
Do you mind? Thank you.
It will carry your strong and powerful voice to
Indeed.
many.
I know, but we worry about our internet audience here. So I agree with John. I think the great promise of this is state by state. And one of the things that happened in the Alaska referendum is that they combined several things in that voter initiative. Actually, ranked choice voting kind of snuck through on the coattails of several other provisions in the ranked choice voting in the voter initiative in Alaska, because people really like the transparency and campaign finance reform elements. So one suggestion, wonder if you've thought about it, is not only trying to push this where possible in the roughly half of the states that have voter initiatives, but maybe to create a democracy package of which 100% voting is one part of it. I have two more comments or questions. You can treat them either way you want. One is, I think part of the challenge we face now, part of the problem we face now, is not only the path dependent starting from the libertarian streak in American culture, but the tremendous erosion of any sense of civic obligation or civic understanding, in part because of the erosion of civic education in the United States. So I'm wondering if your book deals with this problem and how a revival of civic education might go hand in hand with and nurture and propel a movement for universal voting. And so, at risk of piling things on, one more comment, again, really asking you to respond, just thinking in terms of how many people in politics might react to this. You say some of the people who will be added to the rolls are younger people, and Blacks and Latinos and others who are being suppressed. I think that's exactly the point for people who are engaging in voter suppression.
But could I interrupt you just for a sec? Because actually, if you notice what I said low income people, and then it would block the suppression, because one of the points we make on, I pick it up here because I think what you're making an extremely important point here, that we argue that we are not trying to rig the electorate so progressive candidates win the election. Both of us are on the progressive side of politics. But there are a lot of low-income voters, low-income white voters, some low-income Latino voters who actually vote Republican. And we make the point of, when you ask the question, where did Republicans gained House seats in 2020, partly because of higher turnout. And we compare turnout in 2018 where the Democrats were far more mobilized than Republicans were to the turnouts in 2020. And some of the biggest jumps were among working class voters when voting was made easily. So I just want to underscore that we think this does protect against discrimination against Black and Latino Americans and Asian Americans and others. And so, yes, that means some might not want it, but specifically in partisan terms, we think that conservative candidates could do just fine. It might not be good for extreme conservatives. That's an interesting question. And I know one Republican, prominent Republican who will probably not endorse this idea publicly, but it surprised me when he said, I'm all for this because it'll force our party to become more moderate. But anyway, go ahead.
Well,
I love everything else on your
and
list.
it would recruit certain voters from rural areas and so on who would naturally incline toward Republican. My only point in making the list was you've got to have something in it for Republicans, or you're only going to see Democratic leaning states adopt this. And I agree, you got to start state by state, but you got to have a strategy for going national. Anyway, you got any thoughts on civic education?
I want Miles to take that. I just want you to write a whole essay on what you just said, because I would love to see, part of what we're doing here is try to encourage smart people like you thinking creatively about how to work for. Oh, good. So I can't wait to read the essay, but go ahead, Miles.
Well, on the civic education, I think it's essential. And I'm heartened that there are some significant efforts to really increase it, and commissions that have worked on it, et cetera. When I was Secretary of the State, I worked with the League of Women Voters, and we actually did make 6 months of civic education a mandate requirement for graduation in Connecticut high schools. So yes, absolutely. And I do think the point that I made earlier about how universal voting would even encourage that more strongly is important. I just want to take very quickly on the other point that you made about making this into a package. I mean, our hope is that that universal voting becomes one of the agenda items for people who are trying to improve American democracy. And it goes along, I think, you mentioned the partisan election issue and the funding issue, ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting. I think if you think about universal voting where everybody is voting, combined with ranked choice voting where everybody's vote gets counted exactly as they would like it to be counted, as opposed to making strategic voting, I think you have a very good combination. So yes, I think a kind of a package of reforms. The harder part about what we also don't want to say to people who are working really hard, whether it's for national popular vote or for same-day registration, is we'll stop everything and just concentrate on this. We see this as the long-term kind of North Star point, but all of those other reforms are incredibly important as well.
Yeah, I surprise. I agree with my co-author and everything you just said. Just a couple of quick points. One, I couldn't agree more on civics education. And I've always thought we have a good one sitting there in the AP state, local government, federal, state, local government class that could easily be generalized to every student. It's a really pretty good curriculum. And our kids took it, all three of our kids took it. And what we noticed is that the students now, there may be some self-selection here, but I always sense that students who took that came out of the class with more of a sense of efficacy and wanting to do something civic. And it's actually a knowledge-based curriculum. It's value-laden in a sense because it really emphasizes the obligation to participate, but it's also chock full of knowledge about how the political system works and in ways that students can relate to. So I couldn't agree more on the importance of that. In terms of packaging reforms, I think this is a great debate about what goes naturally together, what doesn't. Does one part of a package kill the other part of the package? Certainly in the case of this, broad inclusive reforms which work as a package. I personally strongly support campaign finance reform, would love to see incentives for small donors, which is a democratizing system, to be part of this. But I think that is, I think the more you extend it, the more you have to debate about, does this go with this? Does one part go with the other well in a campaign. But the idea, and lastly, on the transferable vote on the instant runoff, Australia combines the two, and they make that work pretty well.
Right. All right. Steve, was it?
So I'm just wondering how you can work this out to say that we're going to have more young people and more minorities who do tend to be more democratic, but it isn't going to be unfavorable to the Republicans. There are all these studies that show that, in fact, that it doesn't have a favorable impact for one party or the other, but it's really hard to get it across. And in fact, Democrats do think that it will be to their advantage to have a higher turnout, and Republicans think that it will be to their disadvantage, and thus the struggles over voter suppression. But how do you think you can counter that overwhelming perception that, and there's so much data out there. I mean, in fact, particularly Latino voters, they only represent 6.5% of those who vote, but they're in fact 13% of those who are eligible. African Americans are rising, but still they're underperforming. Whites are overperforming. So how do you deal with that? And I know that there are these sort of subtle studies that counteract that, but how can you deal with this overwhelming perception that's really driving people and getting very intense about all the voter suppression issue, and when it's really the same issue that you'll be dealing with as a perception?
Excellent question.
And pardon me, I have to leave a little bit early.
Yeah, that's quite all right. It's good of you to come. Miles and I did a radio show this morning with Arnie Arneson, who is a former politician up in New Hampshire, great woman, a great reformer. She answered that question better than we have. So I'll quote what Arnie said, which is, look at Virginia's races in this year's election. That race was conducted under expansive voting laws passed by the Democrats that increased turnout. The turnout in this year's Virginia governor's race was very high. And guess what? The Republicans swept the state for governor, for lieutenant governor, and for attorney general. Democratic turnout was pretty good, but Republican turnout was through the roof. So in a state that really modeled a lot of the expansions, you had a pretty conservative Republican get elected governor based on a very, very high conservative turnout in rural parts of the state. And I think it's self-defeating for Republicans in the long run anyway. And there are Republicans who are arguing that internally. They're not being very successful right now. But our country will become more diverse. There are signs that the Latino vote is much more up for grabs than people, I think, wrongly assumed it was, because George W. Bush got a big share of the Latino vote. So that I don't think conservatives should fear this. Just by the way, the idea in Australia was pioneered by conservatives. Conservatives were worried about the power of organized labor, and they thought that labor would be more organized than they were. And so they pushed the idea. And then the Labor Party looked at it and said, we think we can do just fine under this system. And it's been very competitive all, for those 100 years, and you've had you've had significant periods of labor rule, significant periods of conservative rule. I think there are a lot of examples, but I totally agree with you that the assumptions that are deeply embedded are hard to fight. And you're correct in reading them the way you do. Miles, do you have a?
I would just say that the argument that you are referencing, is roiling through the kind of voting rights debate and democracy debate now. I mean, this is we won't cause it, but I think that the point of what we're hoping to do is just put this idea into the public debate. It has never been there before. As I said, I've been doing this for 40 years. I never was in a discussion about this until now. And then, of course, people will start to pick at it. We absolutely expect significant opposition and litigation if it were ever passed somewhere. And I think that will, all that is to be expected. But I think once we start to really have the discussion, some Republicans will come out and make the case in support of it. Some people will look at the Virginia election more closely. Anyway, I just think we got to get the discussion going. We're not having embraced the naive, the label of being naive. I was about to say we're not naive. I mean, about how hard this is going to be,
Naive
but I
never
think it's a discussion that ought to begin. That's all I can say in response. I mean, every challenge that you reference is a challenge that we will absolutely face in it, but that's no reason not to start.
But if you succeed, are you going to undermine your democratic support?
I have been challenged. I will say that I have been challenged by some of my progressive Democratic friends to the point of, on the question of, are you really sure this is going to help us? And to be
Really?
honest, what?
I'm surprised.
Yeah.
I have
I'm
a
surprised.
simple refrain for that you can cite to your progressive colleagues.
Go ahead.
My motto is, when in doubt, do the right thing.
Or, yes, but that's essentially what we've said, which is that the fundamental premise that EJ and I are working on here, and I think people who believe in democracy ought to work on, is that it's not about winning partisan advantages. It is about making our democracy fairer, more representative, more inclusive, more vibrant, more participatory, and let the chips fall where they may.
And just to put one more layer on this, there is some evidence in some of the political science literature that governments elected under a system like this tend to be a little bit more sensitive to the needs of moderate and low income voters. That's something progressives should be for, even if Republicans win elections, because you need both parties would need to listen to, have policies that speak to the problems of those currently left out. That's something progressives should be for, even as we know that there's going to be, any real democratic system is going to have alteration between, center left, center right, hopefully not far right. That's going to happen. But if you have a government that has to listen to the voters, young people and voters who are less affluent, that will probably produce better policy, even if you have it run through a conservative prism as opposed to a progressive prism.
All right, another question, and then we have one on Zoom.
Oh, great. Hello, I have a question for you. First of all, it's good to hear that you're outcome agnostic. I think that's what you're trying to say there. In terms of the $20 fine, so I know from having worked with you on your wonderful book that there are 26 countries around the globe that, I think it's 26, right, that have mandatory voting or universal civic participation. And I know that some of them reward people for voting and some of them penalize people for not voting. And I gather that the penalizing people is more effective, but I wonder, can't we do both? Because in the same way, using that word mandatory is so off-putting, penalizing people is very off-putting. Now, we can't bribe people, you can't give them money, but maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the carrots instead of the sticks.
Go ahead. You want to start, Miles? Go ahead.
Sure. This came up significantly in the working group. Obviously, people said, gee, wouldn't it be more American to have an incentive system where rather than an enforcement mechanism? And the answer is yes. And we really talked about this. And there are some examples, at least moderately successful, where there has been a lottery, where you get a lottery ticket if you have voted. In Peru, in some of the Latin American countries, there are benefits that you get. In Peru, by the way, if you have voted, you get a little bit of a bump on your college application. So if all things are equal, the student who voted will get into the college rather than not voted. There are tax, you could imagine a tax cut, or a credit on your income tax for voting. They have it for senior citizens, they have it for low income people. It is possible to do that. So I actually would be in favor of exploring what some of the incentives are. There is an interesting point that we make in our legal chapter, which is this has not been tested in court. They really haven't done it very much. But in the Voting Rights Act, you're forbidden to give anything of value to a voter. So obviously the point of that was that you can't bribe people to vote for your candidate. But might it apply? with the current Supreme Court, for instance, to a generalized incentive. We think it wouldn't. We think that would be okay, but it's actually a closer call than the kind of parallel to the jury service. So the answer, Diane, is that I think it's really worth looking at, but we decided to sort of bite the bullet in a way and say that in the countries where it works the best, there is some modest enforcement, and so we didn't want to like take the easy way out and say let's just give everybody a tax cut.
One idea that I can't, she's thinking about, I don't know if she's introduced it yet, Ayanna Presley of Massachusetts had, is to get around the buying votes ban, is to create $100 tax credit, refundable tax credit for everybody who registers. And I kind of like that idea. I think that would be constitutional because you're not buying votes. And if you make it refundable, it goes to everybody. And we speak sympathetically of that as an idea in the book. There's a chart which we owe to the great political scientist called Shane Singh, who's done a lot of work on various compulsory systems. By the way, John, thank you on universal voting. It's not just a marketing tool, though, because one of the reasons we don't want to call it compulsory voting is because you're not required to cast a ballot for somebody. That's why we have tried to, it really comes from people who advocated for universal service. That's what Bill Galston and I thought of when we first started writing about this. But we have a chart, largely thanks to Shane, on page 63. And it's so interesting because compulsory voting, we'll call it that, universal voting, with modest minimal costs to abstainers, actually produces a slightly higher turnout than civic duty voting with heavy costs on abstainers. So it appears, at least from what we know from the limited pool, but still significant pool of countries that have it, is that moderate, very moderate costs give you the biggest bang and probably pose the fewest political and substantive problems.
Right. All right. Amy, question on Zoom.
I'm going to combine two questions because they're very similar in what they're asking. So they're asking if you can please clarify the definition of full participation. Does it include all people, non-citizens / permanent residents in the county during election, or only legal citizens?
We focus on citizens. We focus on we take what would be right now the conventional definition, which is all citizens 18 or older. We're not, again, this is not some secret effort to radically alter our rules on elections. We have in our history had elections with that, that were open to non-citizens, and we've had there are arguments about localities that are thinking of opening their elections to non-citizens. But our definition for the purposes of this is basically all citizens aged 18 and older.
Excellent. Another question? All right.
Thank you. This is very interesting. One of the questions that is running through my mind is, are there specific elections, as in presidential elections every 4 years, that would be compulsory or in which universal voting would be desirable? Because there are a lot of elections that happen in off years and local elections. Yeah, so that's my question.
Boy, did we debate this. This was a really good question. Miles, why do you want to start on it?
I mean, obviously, this is one where it would be up to the people who write the legislation to figure out which elections it should apply to. I mean, in general, the United States has a lot more elections than many other places. And the idea that we sort of gently recommend is to consolidate, and not have as many elections. We generally say that primary elections, even though in some districts, primary elections are the real elections, but we say this should, generally speaking, not apply to primaries. It's hard to imagine a kind of a requirement to vote in a party primary.
Right.
On the other hand, some of the municipal elections where it matters the most, call it a school board election for the education of your kids, have now 12, 15% turnout. I could imagine a municipality saying, you know, damn it, the education of our kids is important enough to make sure that everybody's going to vote in it. So I think it would be up to the drafters of legislation, but we generally, I think in the book say major elections. And of course, the federal government would control the, you know, the election, the federal. States could actually control for the state elections, constitutional offices, legislative offices, even congressional offices. But so depending on the level of government is what is where the municipalities could clearly only do the municipal elections. So, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Right. One of the reasons our turnout is low is because we have so many elections. We ask people to vote a lot more. Switzerland is kind of like us in that way. Switzerland has a lot of elections and lower turnout. And we actually ask quite a lot of our citizens in a lot of places with the number of elections we have. And so there have been debates over many years about whether you could consolidate elections so that there would be fewer election days. And some localities, you know, put certain kinds of elections at odd times because they're looking to create low turnouts. And that's probably, for us, that's problematic. But we basically say major elections. So clearly, you know, the even year elections we clearly have in mind. We had a big debate in the group about what to do about municipal elections. There are a lot of different opinions. You know, we think voting in municipal elections is a good thing. We think municipalities would do well to have it, but we don't, you know, I think as a practical matter, this will be worked out state to state. So we just stuck with major elections as our definition. But your point about school board elections, which I hadn't thought about until you said it, is really interesting. And I think you could actually start a great debate in a community where, because a lot of those elections with 15% turnout are utterly unrepresentative of the, you know, that 15%. It's, you know, it would be a real odd accident if they actually were a representative of the other 85%.
All right, and we have one more Zoom question.
In a system where everyone votes, how would a system like that be implemented? If you could explain that a little bit more.
Let me just start and I'll let the Secretary of the State. See, even Miles drops it sometimes. I watch him. I listen carefully. This could be implemented in a number of different ways. We have very concrete suggestions in the book about different paths toward this, because we figure that if we're going to propose this, we ought to answer that question. So do you have another one that bounces off this one or no? After, okay. One, the federal government could adopt this for federal elections, just as there are many reforms in the Freedom to Vote Act or the For the People Act that could be applied through the federal government. The federal government, under the Constitution, has power to control federal, to you know, essentially determine how federal elections are held. And the 15th Amendment also gives the federal government a lot of power to prevent discrimination in elections. So that's one way it could happen. We don't expect that to happen tomorrow morning. Another way this could happen is through state legislatures. You know, it's been introduced in Connecticut, Massachusetts. We understand somebody in California actually introduced it, which I want to know more about. And we imagine debates in states. It could be implemented through referendum, or in some states, it could be passed in the legislature in pretty much all states that might choose to take it up. Again, we don't expect these bills to succeed tomorrow morning, but we really want this debate to begin. We'd like more bills of this sort to be introduced across states and have serious hearings and debate through some of the very questions that smart people in this room and on Zoom have already raised today. And then it could be adopted. There are 13 states that give all or many or some of their municipalities considerable room to experiment, where we think, our lawyer friends think, those municipalities could try it on their own. And so we want efforts made at every level of the government to try it. because while we think we have pretty good proof of concept in Australia and a number of other countries, Ecuador uses it and has one of the most stable democracies in South America. I don't want to suggest this is the reason, but it is associated with a very stable democracy. But Americans, Missouri is the show me state, and Americans are show me people. And so we'd like states and cities to show that this can work well and make it an attractive option, as has started to happen with transferable, instant runoffs and the like. And Miles is our organizer, and therefore, I think he might have something to say about this.
Well, I would just say that if I were Secretary of the state of Connecticut still, then what I would do, if assuming the legislature gave the Secretary of the State the responsibility, I would do a major public education campaign. I would really push for civic education to make sure that young people were prepared. I would make sure that the election officials at the local level were properly funded, properly trained, had a real set and had the tools that they needed to really go out and sell this. I might actually, do a first election where you got a warning rather than an actual fine.
I think we might have that in the book, actually.
Yes, it's one possible suggestion in the book. So in other words, how to begin to get this socialized and thought about in a different way than just, oh my God, this is an infringement. So I think there's a whole administrative plan that one could make to make this really succeed. If you had it would definitely require legislation first. So I would support the legislation and then go to work trying to make sure that it really worked.
Excellent. All right, why don't we take a question here and then a final question from Zoom.
Hi. Wanted to know if you've seen any other democracies where the turnout is around 90-ish%, that was what you're saying in Australia is, without having compulsory voting. So, yeah.
The only election I can think of, but I could be wrong, one of the great fun experiences of my life was going to Portugal back in 1975, I believe it was, 75, when they had their first free election after 50 years of dictatorship. And a bunch of friends and I went there for a week and just wandered around the country. And it was one of the most wonderful experiences. If you love democracy, you wanted to be in Portugal at that moment, because it was a country that was starved for self-government. People were so excited. There were posters on ceilings, let alone on walls. You could, I don't speak Portuguese. I understand a little bit because I grew up in a town with a lot of Portuguese immigrants, but you could tell at all the tables in all the restaurants you went to, people were arguing about politics. They had political pins on. And I won't get this number exactly right, but it was something like 80% of the country had voted by noon or something, because they so. Now, that is I do not recommend 50 years of dictatorship as a way of encouraging people to embrace democracy, but it just showed the hunger for democracy. So I want to double check the answer to your questions. The reason I raise that is I suspect you've had certain spikes pretty high in some of our democracies. I think you had some pretty high turnouts in Britain after World War II, for example. And by certain measures, we had high turnout in elections after the Civil War, but it was on the basis of an electorate that, especially after Reconstruction ended, that excluded Black people, that didn't include women, that had the vote at 21. So one of the reasons we focused so much on the high turnout recently in 2020 and 2018 is that was on a close to a full electorate. And so that's my short answer, but you've given me research to do over the next couple of weeks. I don't know if you have another thought on that. It's a very good
Just
question.
on that, like for example, in I'm French, so in France, for the last election, turnout was 76%. For the one just before, I'm talking about presidential election, the most important one for us. The one before 82, I think, something like that. So, yeah.
You've had decent turnout in France. Some of our numbers, by the way, look worse than they are because we tend to measure on total population rather than registered voters, and we have some registration issues. But And by the way, high turnout in certain systems sometimes reflect crisis and not health. High turnouts can mean a healthy democracy. They can suggest a time of crisis. I won't ask you here, but I'd love to ask you afterward. Is Macron in as much trouble as some of the news reports suggest?
Right.
But we can talk after.
All right. So the final question will be from Zoom.
Is there some evidence from counties or countries that have universal voting as electoral behavior for those who started voting as a result of the mandate? Do they seek information, devote time to weigh options, form opinions, et cetera, or just vote more or less randomly?
They don't seem to vote randomly. That's a good question. I mean, I do believe that's a question that lots of people will ask about this system going forward. So I appreciate it. And one of the reasons I read my friend Kim's puckish interview about this is that, and he's campaigned, he's run for office. He ran for office over about 40 years. So he spent a lot of time talking to voters. And it does not appear that voting is random. The other thing is there are certain, there is a share of our electorate today that is not as politically obsessive as other parts of the electorate. So that I think that, the evidence is that the voters brought in by this system, some develop party loyalties also and vote fairly consistently for a party. Others switch on what appears to be a rational basis. Australian politicians certainly assume that these voters are switching on the basis of the problems that the country confronts and arguments they make in the campaign. And the other thing about this, by the way, is it frees up money from all the money we spend right now under this system to turn out voters. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent just to get people to the polls. This system would either cut the cost of campaigns or allow political organizations to shift money into voter persuasion, education, and all kinds of other activities. So I think it has a knock-on effect of increasing on net civic knowledge, since even propaganda can increase civic knowledge as long as it's not utterly, full of lies. And there's propaganda that isn't lying propaganda. Miles, do you want to close?
What he said.
He said, well, thank you so much, EJ and Miles, for joining us today. Thank you to our audience, both here and on Zoom. We hope that this idea will, get more traction in these public debates about how to improve our democracy. Thank you so much.
Can I say
Miles?
one last thing?
Yes,
Didi?
of course.
Okay. I actually had the presence of mind to bring sign-up sheets. So if you are interested, as we go forward and try to develop this campaign, just write your name and your email address on the back and we'll be in touch.
Always the organizer.
And by the way, buy the book. That would be good.
It's right outside. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Didi.